Episode 6, Consciousness After the Body, the complete metaphysical case. Part 1, the construction begins. 5 episodes. We have covered significant ground. The ND research, 50 years of peer-reviewed documentation showing consciousness functioning in the apparent absence of brain activity, including verified perceptions of the external environment during clinical death that resist conventional explanation. The hard problem of consciousness. 30 years of serious philosophical work establishing that the material framework has no account of why physical processes give rise to subjective experiences at all. The quantum measurement problem, a century of experimental physics demonstrating that observation participate in producing physical outcomes at the most fundamental level of reality. The divine mind tradition, a serious philosophical and theological lineage across Fillmore, Holmes, and U.C. Group, rooted in Neoplatonism and idealistic philosophy, developing the consciousness is primary claim with systematic rigor. 6 contemplative traditions: Vedanta, Buddhism, Neoplatonism, Sufism, Kabbalah, Taoism, tended to arrive in 3 shared conclusions about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to physical death. In a personal account, 3 months in a coma at 7 years. Physician conversations recalled from the unconscious state. 54 years of living with what that opened. Each of these examined independently creates significant difficulty for the dismissal of consciousness survival. Each one on its own is enough to establish that the question is more genuinely open than the mainstream narrative acknowledged. This episode takes all of them together and builds a complete argument. Not as proof, I have been careful throughout this series not to claim more than the evidence support. And the most honest account of what 5 lines of inquiry, when examined carefully, held together, when their convergence is taken seriously, suggests about the nature of consciousness and what happened to it when the body dies. The case I'm about to make is not the only possible interpretation of this evidence, but it is the most coherent one available. And coherence and the absence of proof is the standard by which serious intellectual positions are evaluated. Let's build it. The 5 pillars. The complete argument rests on 5 pillars, not 5 separate arguments that each independently prove the conclusion. 5 convergent lines of inquiry that, taken together, make the consciousness survival position significantly more defensible than its dismissal. I want to name them before examining each one of them in depth, because the architecture of the argument matters. The pillars are not a list of supporting evidence. They are structurally different kinds of inquiry: philosophical, scientific, empirical, traditional, and experiential, that approach the same territory from different directions. Pillar 1, the hard problem. The materialistic framework cannot explain why physical processes give rise to subjective experience at all. This is a philosophical finding established through rigorous argument, not empirical research. It doesn't prove consciousness is primary. It established the alternative claim: consciousness is produced by the physical as a fundamental explanatory gap that 30 years of serious work has not closed. Pillar 2, the quantum evidence observation, participation producing physical outcomes at the most fundamental level of reality. This is an experimental finding established through reproducible physics experiments. It doesn't prove consciousness is primary. It established that the strict separation between consciousness and physical reality, which the materialist account requires, is not supported at the quantum level. Pillar 3, the NDE research. Consciousness appears to function in the apparent absence of brain activity, including verified perceptions of the external evidence that resist conventional explanation. This is an empirical finding. Established through peer-reviewed clinical research, it doesn't prove consciousness survived death. It established that brain produces consciousness claim is not consistent with the documented data. Pillar 4, the traditional maps. The traditional maps, 6 independent contemplative traditions developed without meaningful contact during their formative period, arrived at 3 shared conclusions about consciousness: that it's not reducible to the physical, that something continues beyond death, and that the conclusion is directly verifiable through sustained practice. This is a convergence finding. It doesn't prove consciousness is primary. It establishes that the consciousness's primary position has serious independent intellectual lineage across multiple cultural contexts. Pillar 5, the lived account. 3 months in a coma at 7 years old, physician conversation recalled from the unconscious state. 54 years of spontaneous transcendental states confirmed by sleep studies, prophetic accuracy with strangers, empathetic pain response preceding verified events. This is experiential evidence, not peer-reviewed, not independent and verified in a clinical sense, but documented and consistent with other pillars. It doesn't prove consciousness is primary. It represents a lived account, but the other 4 pillars provide the framework to understand. 5 pillars, 5 different kinds of inquiry, 5 different approaches to the same territory. Now let's examine each one and show how they build on each other. Pillar 1, the hard problem. The hard problem is the philosophical foundation of the entire argument. Here's why it matters structurally, not just as an interesting philosophical puzzle, but as the load-bearing base of the case. The mainstream dismissal of consciousness survival rests on the assumption that consciousness is produced by the brain. The assumption is stated as if it were established, as if it were scientific consensus, as if anyone who questions it is rejecting established science in favor of wishful thinking. The hard problem establishes that the assumption has never been established. David Chalmers' argument, why is any physical processes accompanied by experience at all, has not been answered in 30 years of serious work. Not inadequately answered, not answered provisionally, not answered with an explanation that needs refinement, not answered. The materialist framework has produced accounts of how the brain processes information, how it integrates signal, how it directs attention, how it produces behavior. These accounts are genuine and significant. None of them explains why any of this processing is accompanied by subjective experience, why there is something it is like to be you, why the lights are on. The philosopher Thomas Nagel, in his book Mind and Consciousness, extended the hard problem into a broader argument. The materialist neo-Darwinian account of nature, he argued, is almost certainly false because consciousness is so fundamental a feature of reality that any account of the universe that cannot explain its existence is an incomplete account. This is not a fringe position. Nagel is a professor at NYU. His argument has been engaged seriously by the leading philosophers of our mind working today. The hard problem matters for the consciousness survival argument in a specific and structural way. If the materialistic framework cannot explain the existence of consciousness, if it cannot account for why physical processes give rise to experience at all, then its confident assertion that consciousness ends when the brain stops is not a conclusion supported by the framework. It is an assertion made by a framework that has not earned the right to make it. You cannot make authoritative claims about what happens to something you cannot explain the existence of. The hard problem does not prove consciousness survived death. It established that a framework claiming consciousness entered death has a fundamental exponential gap at its foundation. And a framework with a functional, unexplained gap at its foundation is not the set of science it presents itself as. Pillar 1 is in place. Pillar 2, the quantum evidence. The hard problem established a philosophical gap at the foundation of the materialist account. The quantum evidence established an empirical disruption at its base. The materialist account of consciousness requires a specific picture of physical reality. It requires that physical reality exists independently of observation, that matter and energy behave in determinate law-governed ways regardless of whether any conscious observer is present, that the physical world is the ground and consciousness is the product, with a clear one-directional relationship between them. Quantum mechanics disrupts this picture at the most fundamental level of physical description. The double-slit experiment, replicated thousands of times, established that observation participates in producing physical outcome. A particle behaves differently when observed than when it is unobserved. The act of measurement changes the result. This is not interpretation. This is data. The Copenhagen interpretation, the dominant framework for understanding quantum mechanics, takes the observer dependent seriously. Niels Bohr's conclusion is not meaningful to speak of what a quantum system is doing when it's not being observed. John von Neumann's mathematical analysis, the chain of physical causation, cannot account for the collapse of the wave function without invoking a non-physical observer at the end of the chain. Eugene Wigner's explicit conclusion, consciousness is not produced by physical processes. It is fundamental to reality. Roger Penrose's work on quantum consciousness cannot be accounted for by classical computation and arises from quantum processes at a substrate level. And the principle of unitary. Quantum information is conserved, not destroyed, transformed when the system changes, but conserved. What does Pillar 2 contribute to complete argument? It established that the strict separation between consciousness and the physical reality, which is a materialist account required, is not supported by physics. If observation participates in producing physical outcome, if the observer and the observed are not fully separable at the most fundamental level of physical description, then the picture of consciousness is a passive product of a physical world that exists independently, cannot be maintained. The physics doesn't establish that consciousness is primary, but it establishes that the alternative consciousness is a late emerging byproduct of a consciousness-independent world is in tension with its most fundamental finding. Pillar 2 is in place. Part number 5, Pillar 3, the NDE research, near-death research. Pillar 1 and 2 are theoretical. They establish problems for materialist framework from within philosophy and physics. Pillar 3 is empirical. It represents data that the materialist framework cannot adequately explain. 50 years of peer-reviewed NDE research, von Lancet study, pioneers work at NYU Langone, Grayson's 40 years at the University of Virginia, the verified perception cases, Pam Reynolds, the Denter case, the shoe case, and the blind side cases. The specific contribution of Pillar 3 to complete argument is this. The materialist framework made a testable prediction. If consciousness is produced by the brain and ends when the brain stops, if there's no consciousness in the absence of brain activity, then there should be no reported consciousness during periods of clinical death. The NDE research contradicts the prediction, not just with subjective reports of experience during clinical death. Those potentially be explained by residual brain activity or post-hoc reconstruction, however, inadequately. But with verified perceptions of the external physical environment, the accurate description of events and the objects and the conversation that occurred during a period of clinical death from vantage points outside the body, subsequently confirmed by independent witnesses. The materialist framework not only fails to predict these findings, it actively predicts their absence. And they are present. In peer-reviewed literature in the Lancet at NYU Langone, at the University of Virginia, investigated by skeptical researchers who entered the field expecting to find conventional explanation and found instead the conventional explanations were inadequate. The NDE research does not prove consciousness survived death. It established that the brain produces consciousness model is not consistent with a documented empirical record. A model that makes a testable prediction and that prediction is contradicted by peer-reviewed data is not a settled model. It's a model under pressure from its own evidence base. Pillar 3 is in place. Part number 6, Pillar 4, the traditional maps. The first 3 pillars are constructed from modern Western sources, philosophy, physics, and clinical research. Pillar 4 adds a different kind of evidence, not peer-reviewed, not reproducible in the laboratory, but significant in a different way. The convergent testimony of 6 independent contemplative traditions across thousands of years. I made a case in episode 5 for why this convergence matters. Let me state the specific contribution to the complete argument here. The consciousness's primary claim is not a new idea generated by discomfort with mortality. It is a considered conclusion of a sustained, disciplined, rigorous inquiry conducted across multiple independent cultural contexts by people who had no obvious motive to agree with each other and who disagreed with each other on many significant points. Vedanta, Buddhism, Neoplatonism, Sufism, Kabbalah, or Taoism, 6 traditions, independently developed, converge on 3 shared conclusions. Consciousness is not reducible to the physical. Something continues beyond physical death. The conclusion is directly verifiable through sustained practice. What Pillar 4 contributes to the complete argument is specifically this. It established that the consciousness's primary position is not a position invented to comfort people beyond death. It predates the contemporary consciousness debate by millennia. It was arrived at through methods sustained contemplative inquiry, disciplined interior investigation that are as rigorous in their own domain as peer-reviewed science is in its domain. The dismissal of these traditions are merely credulous or wishful requires dismissing thousands of years of inquiry by people who were not making the claim in response to scientific materialism. They were making it as the conclusion of their own investigation, arrived at before the materialist alternative existed as a philosophical position. That is significant intellectual burden that the dismissal rarely acknowledges. Additionally, and this is the specific convergence that matters most for the complete argument, the feature described by these traditions in the account of consciousness and after death corresponds in striking ways to what the ND research independently documents. The Tibetan Bardo, the Vedantic account of Jiva's post-death transition, the Neoplatonic soul release from embodiment, the Sufi Fana, these were not written in response to Van Lommel's Lancet study. They were written centuries or millennia before it, and they describe the same territory, that independent correspondence between clinical, contemplative maps and modern clinical documentation is not proof of consciousness survival. It is one more direct line of inquiry pointing in the same direction. Pillar 4 is in the place. Point number 7, Pillar 5, the lived account. The fifth pillar is one I can speak about from the inside. I have kept it for last deliberately, not because it's the weakest pillar, because it carries a different kind of authority than the first four. And that authority is most effective when the first four have already established by the framework within which it can be understood. The lived account. 3 months in a coma at 7 years and following violent trauma. A 2-foot stake in the back of the neck, 1 millimeter from paralysis. During those 3 months, during the period in which every clinical measure available indicated the absence of measurable brain activity, I was somewhere. I could hear the physician, their conversation, their clinical assessment, their words to each other in a room where I was, by the materialist framework, own accounting, not there. When I came back, when the 3 months ended and the body began to respond again, those conversations came back with me. This account has never formally been published in peer-reviewed literature. The physicians in that period are both deceased. What documentation exists is clinical rather than investigative. But the account is consistent with every feature the ND literature document as characteristic of verified perceptor during clinical death. It's corroborated by the clinical reality of my survival. A survival that the prognosis did not favor and that the physician involved discussed in terms of, I heard and I recalled, beyond the coma, 54 years of spontaneous transcendental state in public confirmed by clinical sleep studies as not ordinary sleep, consciousness present and tracking while the body registered as in a different state. Prophetic accuracy with strangers, documented in writing, spoken in ear, verified at the end by people concerned. Empathic pain response to preceding verified events. The pain in my right side hours before my son's emergency appendectomy. The same location, the same quality. Before I knew, a father's 3 words, heal my son John, and the tumor the size of a ball that appeared in multiple imaging modalities and disappeared before the scheduled biopsy. These are not stories I'm presenting as peer-reviewed evidence. They are the account of a lived-in territory that the first 4 pillars provide, that a framework to understand. What Pillar 5 contributes to the complete argument is what no peer-reviewed study can contribute. The testimony of someone who has been inside the evidence for 54 years, not observing it from a distance, not theorizing about it, living inside it, testing the framework against actual experience, finding it adequate, not because it is comfortable, but because nothing else hold the full weight of what has actually happened. The first 4 pillars establish the intellectual data. The 5th pillar shows what That case looks like lived from inside of a single human life. Pillar 5 is in place. Point number 8, the complete argument. 5 pillars. Now let me assemble them in the complete argument. The argument is not a chain of deductive logic where each premise leads necessarily to the conclusion. It is a cumulative case, 5 independent lines of inquiry that converge on a conclusion that none of them individually establishes, but all of them together make significantly more defensible than the alternative. Here's a complete argument stated as precisely as I can use it. The materialist account of consciousness claims consciousness is produced by the brain. When the brain stops functioning, consciousness ends. Death is a permanent cessation of subjective experience. Against this claim, we have established from philosophy, the materialist framework has no account of why processes give rise to subjective experience at all. A framework that cannot explain the existence of the phenomenon it claims to account for has not earned the right to make confident claims about the phenomenon's termination. Pillar 1. From physics, observation participates in producing physical outcomes at the most fundamental level of reality. The strict separation between consciousness and physical reality, which the materialist account requires, but is not supported by physics. Quantum information is conserved, not destroyed. Pillar 2. From clinical research, consciousness has been documented functioning in the apparent absence of brain activity, including verified perceptions of the external environment that were subsequently confirmed by independent witnesses. The brain produces consciousness models, central prediction, no consciousness in the absence of brain activity is contradicted by peer-reviewed data. Pillar 3. From contemplative inquiry, 6 independent traditions across thousands of years converge on the conclusion that consciousness is not reducible to the physical, that something continues beyond physical death, with descriptions of the post-death transition that independently correspond to fundamental clinical NDE documentation. Pillar 4. From lived experience, a documented account of consciousness functioning during 3 months of clinical coma, including physician conversation recalled from the unconscious state, embedded within 54 years of consciousness, phenomena that are consistent with the framework established by the first 4 pillars and inadequately explained by the materialist alternative. Pillar 5. The conclusion. The dismissal of conscious survival is not a scientific, settled, intellectual rigorous position it presents itself as. It is a philosophical commitment defended with institutional authority that is under sustained pressure from the independent lines of inquiry across philosophy, physics, clinical research, contemplative tradition, and lived experience. The most intellectually honest position, the position that the weight of the evidence supports, is this: consciousness is more likely primary than produced. Physical death is more likely a transition in the mode of consciousness expression than it is termination. The framework most adequate to the full weight of the evidence is the one divine mind tradition has been developing over a century. That consciousness is the ground, the body is the instrument, and the cessation of instrument does not terminate the consciousness that was expressing to it. This is a complete argument. Point number 9, what the argument doesn't prove. I have been careful throughout this series to maintain the distinction between what the evidence establishes and what it doesn't. This episode required that care more than any other, because building the contemplative argument creates its own temptation. The temptation to present the convergence of the five pillars as settling the question definitively, as closing the inquiry rather than opening it more honestly. I want to resist that temptation explicitly. The argument does not prove consciousness survives death. It establishes that the dismissal of consciousness survival is not intellectually justified. That is a different and more limited claim. The dismissal is not justified. That does not mean the survival is established. The argument does not specify what consciousness survival looks like, whether individual identity persists beyond death, whether consciousness evolved or developed post-death, whether it retains memory and personality or dissolves into a universal ground, whether the process is the same for everyone or varies by the quality of consciousness developed in life. These are questions the five pillars leave genuinely open. The NDE account suggests some specific features of the immediate post-death transition. The contemplative traditions offer various accounts of what follows. The divine mind framework makes specific claims. None of these individually or together provides this kind of verified, reproducible evidence that would establish the specific features of post-death consciousness with confidence. The argument does not resolve the disagreement between the traditions. Buddhism and Vedanta make genuinely different claims about the permanent self. Neoplatonism, hierarchical emanation, differs from Sufism, Wadat al-Wujud. The specific account of what continues at death differs across 6 traditions. These disagreements are not resolved by the convergence on the 3 shared claims. The argument does not substitute for direct experience. Every serious tradition surveyed in episode 5 insists that a consciousness is primary. Conclusion is not something to believe on the basis of argument. It is something to be directly verified through sustained practice. The argument can establish the intellectual case for taking that practice seriously. It cannot replace the practice. Point number 10, what changes? If the complete argument is accepted not as true, but as the most honest available account of what evidence suggests, what changes? Not everything, not immediately, not dramatically, but some things change fundamentally. The relationship to death changes, not uncertainty about what comes after, not into the comfortable assurance of a specific afterlife account, into something more honest that both the false certainty of materialist dismissal and the false certainty of doctrinal religious assurance, into genuine openness. The acknowledgement that the most intellectually honest position, the one that evidence supports, is that consciousness is more likely to continue than end. That changes how death is held. Not eliminated as a fact, not denied as a boundary, but released from the specific terror of permanent non-existence that a materialist framework imposes would have been earned the right to impose it. The relationship to the present moment changes. If consciousness is primary, if it is the ground rather than the product of the physical, then the ordinary moments of conscious experience are not incidental byproducts of biological machinery. They are the primary reality expression through a particular form. The attention you bring to this moment, the awareness reading these words, the consciousness experiencing what you are experiencing right now. This is not a late emergent complexity of matter. This is the ground of reality being itself through you that changes what attention means, what presence means, what it means to be here. The relationship to the interior work changes. Everything in the first series, the framework, the practices, the deep dive was about the interior work, the cultivation of honest self-examination, pattern recognition, genuine presence. If consciousness is primary, if the interior is not just a functional byproduct of the biological, but the actual ground of reality expression for a particular life, then the interior work is not self-improvement. It is the primary work, not preparation for something else, not the means to an external end, the thing itself. The consciousness that builds the universe to investigating its own nature through a particular human form. That is a different understanding of what the interior work is for, and it changes quietly, fundamentally, in the texture of daily experience, how that word is engaged. So let's bring this to a close. 6 episodes, one carefully constructed argument, built from philosophy, physics, clinical research, contemplative tradition, and 54 years of lived experience inside the territory the argument describes. The argument is not true. I have said so throughout, and I say so again. It is the most honest account I know how to give of what the evidence suggests. And here's what I want to leave with you as this argument completes. The question, what happened to consciousness after death, is not a question that deserves dismissal. It deserves the same intellectual seriousness that we can bring to any question of comparable significance. The evidence, all 5 pillars of its support taken seriously. The tradition, 6 of them, independently developed, have been taken seriously for millennia. And the person presenting this argument has been living inside the evidence since he was 7 years old, not as an academic exercise, not as content creation, as the most pressing question of his actual life, answered provisionally, honestly, without forced certainty, by the framework that has proven most adequately to the full weight of what has actually happened. Consciousness is primary. The body is the instrument. The cessation of the instrument is not the cessation of the consciousness that was expressed through it. That is the most honest position available. It is the position this series has been building towards. And it changes everything about how you understand yourself. Not as a biological accident producing a temporary consciousness, but as consciousness itself, expressing through this particular life right now. The next 4 episodes go deeper into specific dimensions of this framework. The spontaneous states of what they reveal, consciousness and healing, the hard questions this framework cannot yet understand and answer, and finally, how to live from all of this. How the complete metaphysical case changes not just what you believe, but how you inhabit your daily life. Link above. Take care of yourself.